Case 1. Keith Todd Ashley, a registered nurse and licensed financial advisor, used a paralytic drug, the kind found in hospital settings, before staging his client's death as a suicide. That client had trusted him with nearly $2 million. Keith Todd Ashley spent 18 years as a registered financial advisor in North Texas. He also worked as a registered nurse and owned a brewery outside Dallas. Behind that respectable image, he was running a fraud scheme that drained at least 9 clients of a combined $1.9 million. One of those clients was James Segan, a 62-year-old man from Carrollton, Texas. Segan trusted Ashley not just with his money, but with his health. Ashley had access to his medical history and his finances at the same time, a combination investigators would later call central to the case. Records show Ashley used client funds to cover personal debts and prop up his struggling business. As scrutiny grew, financial pressure mounted. Segan held a life insurance policy worth close to $2 million. At some point, the beneficiary on that policy was quietly changed to a trust connected to Ashley. In February of 2020, Segan was found dead in his home from a gunshot wound. The scene was staged to resemble a suicide. A typewritten note was left behind, naming Ashley as a trusted friend. Investigators quickly identified inconsistencies. The medical examiner noted Segan was right-handed, yet the firearm was found in his left hand. Toxicology reports later revealed the presence of a paralytic agent, a substance not typically self-administered, and one that Ashley, as a nurse, had professional access to. Carrollton police, working alongside federal investigators, began tracing Ashley's financial records. What emerged was a pattern: falsified account statements, unauthorized transfers, and a life insurance policy redirected just before Segan's death. Federal prosecutors built a case combining the financial fraud with the circumstances of Segan's death. The investigation extended beyond Segan to multiple other victims who had unknowingly invested their savings into Ashley's scheme. In October of 2024, a federal jury convicted Ashley on 17 counts, including wire fraud, mail fraud, bank fraud, and a charge related to use of a firearm in connection with a violent crime. He was initially sentenced to life in federal prison. On appeal, a federal appeals court vacated that sentence and several of the convictions, sending the case back for resentencing. In June of 2025, a federal judge resentenced Ashley to 60 years in prison. Separately, state prosecutors in Texas pursued a capital murder charge connected directly to Segan's death, a case that remains in the legal system. The investigation into Ashley's case highlighted a growing area of concern for regulators: the overlap between financial trust and medical access. Few professionals hold both forms of intimate knowledge over a client's life. When that trust is exploited for financial gain, the consequences can be severe. Financial industry watchdogs have since cited the Ashley case in discussions about oversight gaps, noting that warning signs in his client complaints and account irregularities existed well before Segan's death. The case remains a reference point for examining how financial misconduct can escalate when left unchecked. Today, Ashley remains in federal custody, with the state case in Texas still pending. Investigators continue to review the full scope of his financial dealings, and additional victims have come forward since his initial conviction. The case underscores a difficult truth: that professional credentials and community standing do not guarantee integrity. For families entrusting their finances and their care to a single advisor, the Ashley case raises lasting questions about how such dual access can be monitored and how clients can protect themselves from those who hold both their money and their medical information. Case 2. Natalie Cochran. A pharmacist running a $2.5 million investment fraud injected her own husband with a fatal dose of insulin just as her scheme was about to collapse. Natalie Cochran worked as a licensed pharmacist in Raleigh County, West Virginia. Between 2017 and 2019, she convinced at least 11 people to invest a combined $2.5 million into what she described as government contracting opportunities through a company called Tactical Solutions Group. The contracts did not exist. Cochran used new investor money to pay earlier investors, a structure consistent with a Ponzi scheme. She funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars into a personal lifestyle that included a 1965 Shelby Cobra and other luxury purchases. As the scheme began to unravel, with a bank meeting approaching that would have exposed the fraud, Cochran's husband, Michael Brandon Cochran, became a liability. In February of 2019, Michael was injected with a fatal, non-prescribed dose of insulin. Cochran delayed seeking medical help. His death was initially ruled to be from natural causes, and the case did not raise immediate suspicion. It was the financial fraud investigation that led investigators back to Michael's death. As federal agents traced the money and uncovered fabricated contracts and falsified documents, questions emerged about the timing of his death relative to the scheme's collapse. His body was exhumed, and a renewed examination led medical examiners to rule the death a homicide. Federal prosecutors pursued the financial fraud charges first. In 2020, Cochran pleaded guilty to wire fraud and money laundering. She was sentenced in March of 2021 to over 11 years in federal prison and ordered to pay close to $2.6 million in restitution to her victims. The homicide case proceeded separately in state court. Prosecutors built a timeline connecting the financial pressure Cochran faced to the circumstances of her husband's death, presenting toxicology evidence and testimony about the unraveling investment scheme. In January of 2025, a jury in Raleigh County convicted Cochran of first-degree murder. She was sentenced the following day to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The case drew significant attention from national crime coverage and television networks, due in part to the unusual combination of a licensed pharmacist, a multi-year investment fraud, and a homicide tied directly to financial motive. Investigators noted that Cochran's professional background gave her both the knowledge and the access necessary to carry out the act without immediate detection. Court records indicate that several of Cochran's investors lost their life savings, with some not recovering their funds even after her conviction and the restitution order. The case remains active in terms of post-conviction motions, with defense filings challenging aspects of the murder conviction following sentencing. The Cochran case illustrates how financial fraud and violent crime can intersect when a scheme nears collapse. Investigators and prosecutors highlighted the importance of examining sudden or unexplained deaths in close proximity to financial irregularities, a pattern that ultimately connected two separately initiated investigations into a single prosecution. Case 3. Helen Golay and Olga Rutterschmidt. Two elderly Los Angeles women took out multiple life insurance policies on men they had taken into their care, then collected more than $2 million combined after staged accidents ended those men's lives 6 years apart. Helen Golay and Olga Rutterschmidt operated independently of any financial institution, but their method mirrored an investment scheme built on human lives instead of stocks or property. The two women, both in their 70s during the period of their crimes, sought out men experiencing homelessness or financial hardship in the Los Angeles area. The first victim was Paul Vados, 63 years old at the time of his death in 1999. The two women took him into temporary housing, secured documentation in his name, and applied for life insurance policies naming themselves as beneficiaries. After approximately 2 years, Vados died in what was reported as a hit-and-run incident. Insurance companies paid out on the policies. The case did not raise immediate red flags, since hit-and-run deaths involving transient individuals were not unusual occurrences for investigators to review at the time. 6 years later, in 2005, a second man, Kenneth McDavid, 50 years old, died under circumstances investigators would later describe as remarkably similar. McDavid had also been taken in by the two women, who again secured multiple life insurance policies in his name before his death in another reported hit-and-run. It was the similarity between the two cases that drew investigator attention. A detective reviewing unrelated case files noticed the parallel patterns, multiple policies, a similar age range for the women, and nearly identical circumstances surrounding both deaths. That observation opened a renewed investigation. Financial records showed that Golay had received more than $1.5 million from policies connected to McDavid alone. while Rutterschmidt had received close to $675,000. Combined claims connected to both victims exceeded $4 million across multiple insurance companies. Investigators built a case using insurance documentation, witness testimony from people who had seen the women with both victims, and reconstruction evidence from the scenes of both deaths. Prosecutors argued the pattern showed deliberate planning rather than coincidence. In April of 2008, a jury convicted both women of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder for financial gain. The presiding judge addressed the women directly during sentencing, describing the calculated nature of their actions toward vulnerable men. Both were sentenced to consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. The case became a reference point for insurance fraud investigators nationwide, prompting discussion about how multiple policies taken out on the same individual by unrelated parties could be flagged earlier. Industry analysts noted that no single insurance company had visibility into the full pattern, since each policy was filed separately with different providers. Golay and Rutterschmidt's case remains one of the most documented examples of insurance-motivated fraud resulting in multiple deaths, and it continues to be studied in discussions of elder fraud, exploitation of vulnerable populations, and gaps in financial industry information sharing. Case 4. Kevin Pushia. A Baltimore pastor took out a $1.4 million life insurance policy on a disabled man he claimed was his brother, then paid for that man's death to collect the payout. Kevin Pushia worked in non-profit operations and served as a pastor in the Baltimore area. His victim was Lemuel Wallace, a 37-year-old man who was legally blind and had developmental disabilities, living in a group home at the time. Pushia represented himself to insurance companies as Wallace's brother, a claim that was false. Using this fabricated relationship, he applied for and secured multiple life insurance policies on Wallace, with a combined value of approximately $1.4 million. To carry out his plan, investigators found that Pushia used funds connected to his church to arrange for Wallace's death. In February of 2009, Wallace died in a public restroom in Leakin Park in Baltimore. The investigation into Wallace's death initially proceeded as a standalone homicide case. It was insurance industry scrutiny that connected the dots. An agent noticed inconsistencies in the policy applications and alerted authorities to the false brother claim and the unusually high coverage amount for someone with Wallace's circumstances. Detectives obtained a personal planner belonging to Pushia that referenced the case using a coded notation, language investigators interpreted as confirming premeditation. Financial records further tied payments from Pushia to individuals connected to Wallace's death. Prosecutors built their case around the insurance fraud motive, the falsified family relationship, and the financial trail connecting Pushia to the people who carried out the killing. The case highlighted how vulnerable individuals in group homes or assisted living settings can be targeted specifically because they may lack family oversight of their affairs. In 2010, Pushia pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit murder and 7 counts of insurance fraud. He was sentenced in October of 2011 to life in prison, plus an additional 45 years. The case drew attention from disability advocacy organizations, who used it to push for stronger safeguards around life insurance policies taken out on individuals with diminished capacity to consent or oversee their own financial affairs. Insurance regulators in Maryland reviewed underwriting practices following the case, examining how policies with limited family verification had been approved. Wallace's case remains cited in discussions about protecting people with disabilities from financial exploitation, particularly in situations where a caretaker or claimed family member gains both legal and financial standing to benefit from that person's death. The investigation into Pushia's actions also led to scrutiny of his church's financial records, as funds intended for charitable or religious purposes had reportedly been diverted to facilitate the crime. The case remains a significant example of how religious or community trust can be exploited alongside financial motive. Case 5. Dorice Moore. A woman with a prior fraud conviction inserted herself into a lottery winner's finances by claiming to write his life story, then took control of his accounts before he disappeared entirely. Dorice Moore, known to acquaintances as Dee Dee, had a documented history of insurance fraud before she encountered Abraham Shakespeare. Shakespeare had won a $30 million Florida lottery jackpot in November of 2006, opting for a lump sum payment of $17 million. Moore approached Shakespeare, claiming she wanted to write a book documenting his story as a sudden lottery winner navigating newfound wealth. Over time, she positioned herself as his financial advisor, gaining access to and eventually control over significant portions of his remaining lottery winnings. Financial records later showed Moore withdrew approximately $1 million from accounts connected to Shakespeare, using the funds to purchase luxury vehicles and other personal items. As her control over his finances deepened, Shakespeare's contact with friends and family became less frequent. In 2009, Shakespeare disappeared. Moore told family members varying stories about his whereabouts, at one point claiming he was traveling. Investigators later determined that Shakespeare had died and that Moore had impersonated him in electronic communications to delay suspicion. Law enforcement located Shakespeare's remains, buried beneath a concrete slab on property connected to Moore. The discovery shifted the investigation from a missing persons case to a homicide investigation, directly tied to the financial fraud Moore had been conducting. Prosecutors presented evidence showing a clear financial motive: the timeline of Moore's increasing control over Shakespeare's assets, her luxury purchases following his disappearance, and her efforts to maintain the appearance that he was still alive. The case combined forensic evidence from the burial site with extensive financial documentation. In December of 2012, a jury convicted Moore of first-degree murder. The presiding judge described her conduct during sentencing as calculated and methodical, sentencing her to life in prison without parole, plus an additional 25 years. The case drew significant national attention due to the unusual circumstances of a lottery winner being targeted by someone posing as a biographer and financial advisor. It has since been featured in multiple documentary programs examining how sudden wealth can attract predatory financial relationships. Financial advisors and victim advocacy groups have referenced the Shakespeare case in discussions about protecting lottery winners and others who experience sudden financial windfalls, noting the importance of independent financial counsel and family oversight during periods of significant life change. The case remains a frequently cited example of how an individual with a documented history of fraud was able to gain complete control over another person's finances and identity, ultimately resulting in that person's death and an extended effort to conceal it. Case 6. Edward Shin, a business partner with a gambling debt and a prior embezzlement conviction, needed sole control of a company's finances, and his partner's signature stood in the way. Edward Shin co-owned a lead generation company called 800 Exchange with his business partner, Chris Smith, age 31. Prior to this partnership, Shin had been convicted of embezzling funds from a previous employer, a company called LG Technologies, and faced an order to pay approximately $800,000 in restitution in order to avoid incarceration. Facing significant financial pressure and reportedly struggling with gambling debts, Shin needed greater access to the company's funds than his partnership arrangement allowed. Smith's signature and approval were required for certain financial transactions, creating friction as Shin's need for capital grew more urgent. In June of 2010, Smith disappeared. In the months that followed, Shin began sending emails and messages from accounts associated with Smith, describing an extended trip involving international travel. Family members and business associates grew suspicious of the inconsistencies in these communications over time. Investigators began examining financial records connected to the business and noted that Shin had gained increasing control over company assets following Smith's disappearance. Digital forensics later identified inconsistencies in the timing and language of messages sent under Smith's identity, evidence that did not match Smith's typical communication patterns. Smith's body was never recovered, which made the case particularly challenging for prosecutors. Building a circumstantial case, investigators relied heavily on financial records, digital evidence of identity impersonation, and testimony from people who had interacted with Shin during the period following Smith's disappearance. The case proceeded slowly due to the absence of physical remains, requiring prosecutors to establish through other means that Smith was deceased and that Shin was responsible. Financial gain was presented as the central motive, supported by records showing Shin's mounting debts and his subsequent benefit from full control of the business. In 2018, a jury convicted Shin of first-degree murder with special circumstances related to financial gain. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The case became notable among investigators for demonstrating how digital impersonation could be used to delay discovery of a crime, with Shin's effort to maintain Smith's online presence cited as a significant factor in the timeline of the investigation. It has since been referenced in discussions of digital forensics and identity verification in business partnership disputes. The Shin case remains one of the more complex prosecutions in this category due to the lack of a recovered body, illustrating how circumstantial financial and digital evidence can support a conviction when direct physical evidence is unavailable. Case 7, Sante and Kenneth Kimes. A mother and son team forged a deed to a multi-million-dollar Manhattan townhouse, but first they needed the elderly widow who owned it to disappear without a trace. Sante Kimes and her son Kenneth Kimes Jr. had an extensive history of fraud, theft, and related offenses prior to their final scheme. Their target was Irene Silverman, an 82-year-old former performer who owned and managed a townhouse property in Manhattan valued at approximately $7 million. Kenneth rented a unit within Silverman's property under a false identity, gaining access to her home and daily routines. Over time, the mother and son pair developed a plan to forge ownership documents for the property, requiring that Silverman herself be removed from the situation entirely. In July of 1998, Silverman disappeared. Her body was never recovered. When investigators began searching the Kimes' belongings following an unrelated arrest, they discovered a forged deed to Silverman's property, her social security card, and detailed planning notebooks outlining the scheme. The absence of a body again posed a significant challenge for prosecutors, similar to other cases in this pattern. Investigators built their case using the forged documents, witness testimony regarding Kenneth's false identity within the building, and a pattern of similar fraudulent conduct connected to the pair in other jurisdictions, including a separate case involving a man named David Kasdan in California. Prosecutors presented evidence showing that the Kimes had planned the property theft meticulously, including researching the legal process for transferring ownership and preparing documentation in advance of Silverman's disappearance. This premeditation became central to securing convictions, despite the lack of physical remains. In May of 2000, a jury convicted both Sante and Kenneth Kimes of murder and related fraud and forgery charges. Sante Kimes was sentenced to 120 years to life in prison. Kenneth Kimes Jr. received a sentence of 126 years to life. Sante Kimes died in prison in 2014. The case remains one of the most extensively documented examples of property-motivated fraud, resulting in the death of an elderly victim, drawing comparisons in subsequent years to other cases involving forged deeds and elder financial exploitation. Legal scholars and elder abuse advocates have referenced the Kimes case in discussions of property fraud targeting elderly homeowners, particularly those living alone or managing valuable real estate without close family oversight. The case prompted broader conversations in New York City about verifying property ownership transfers and protecting elderly residents from tenants or associates seeking to exploit their access. The Kimes case continues to be studied for its combination of long-term fraud, property law manipulation, and the challenges prosecutors faced in securing a conviction without a recovered body. Case 8. Christian Gerhartsreiter. A German national built an entire false identity as an American heir, working his way into elite social and financial circles for decades, but his fabricated past traced back to a property in California where a young man had gone missing years earlier. Christian Karl Gerhartsreiter arrived in the United States from Germany as a young man and began constructing a series of false identities over subsequent decades, eventually settling on the persona of Clark Rockefeller. presenting himself as connected to the prominent Rockefeller family. Using this fabricated identity, he moved through finance industry roles and elite social circles, eventually marrying a successful business executive. Years before adopting this identity, while living under a different alias, Gerhartsreiter rented property from a family in San Marino, California. The family's son, John Sohus, age 27, lived on the same property. In 1985, Sohus disappeared, along with his wife, Linda, who has never been found. Gerhartsreiter left the area shortly after the disappearance and began constructing new identities in other parts of the country, eventually arriving at the Clark Rockefeller persona that would define his public life for years. The case involving Sohus remained unsolved and largely dormant for nearly a decade. In 1994, human remains were discovered buried on the property where Gerhartsreiter had once lived. Forensic analysis identified the remains as belonging to John Sohus. However, investigators at the time lacked sufficient evidence connecting the disappearance directly to Gerhartsreiter, who had since vanished into his fabricated identity. The case remained cold until 2008, when Gerhartsreiter, then living as Clark Rockefeller, took his daughter during a supervised visitation dispute connected to his divorce. The resulting law enforcement search and media attention led investigators to uncover his true identity and his connection to the decades-old San Marino property. With Gerhartsreiter's real identity established, cold case investigators reopened the Sohus disappearance, connecting forensic evidence from the 1994 discovery to Gerhartsreiter through DNA and circumstantial evidence regarding his residence and abrupt departure from the property in 1985. Prosecutors built their case using decades-old forensic evidence, alongside newly available identification testimony from people who had known Gerhartsreiter under his earlier alias. The trial drew significant attention due to the extraordinary nature of his decades-long impersonation across multiple false identities. In April of 2013, a jury convicted Gerhartsreiter of first-degree murder. He was sentenced in August of 2013 to 27 years to life in prison. The case remains widely studied for its combination of long-term identity fraud and a cold case homicide investigation that depended on advances in forensic science to finally connect a decades-old crime to a person who had successfully concealed his identity for more than 20 years. It continues to serve as a reference point in discussions of identity verification, cold case forensic methods, and the extreme length some individuals will pursue to escape their past. 8 cases, 1 pattern. Trust given freely and exploited deliberately. The professionals you'd expect to protect your future were the ones who ended it. If there's a lesson here, it's this. Oversight isn't optional, even when the person managing your money also seems to be your friend. If this kind of case keeps you thinking long after the video ends, that's exactly what this channel is built for. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because next week's case might be the one you can't stop talking about. Want it punchier or more in line with your usual sign-off style?